I remember the exact moment when my heart started racing, and my breath came short before I even had a chance to think clearly. It was a simple opportunity, something that, on paper, seemed pretty straightforward. But the minute I saw it, a wave of hesitation washed over me, heavy and unshakable. I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down at a foggy void that whispered, "What if you fall again?" I tried to steady myself, tell my mind to focus, to be rational, but my body already knew the answer. I stepped back. I didn't take the chance. This wasn't the first time. Far from it. That hesitation, that freeze, has become a recurring character in my story. I've stumbled before, more times than I care to admit. I've trusted decisions that turned out wrong, handed my money over to ventures that crumbled, and faced criticisms that clung to me longer than I expected. Each of those moments didn't just leave financial scars. They left emotional ones so deep they shaped how I see every new possibility. I learned, sometimes painfully, that losing money is never just about the numbers. It's about trust broken. It's about feeling foolish when you look back. It's about the judgment you think you hear in others' voices, even when no one says a word. But more than anything, it's about what happens inside me afterward, the tightness in my chest, the cold knot in my stomach, the whispering doubts that settle in the quiet hours. A voice convincing me it's safer not to try than to risk making the same mistakes again. But this isn't just a story about fear. It's about how that fear moves quietly beneath the surface, shaping my choices without me even realizing it. I start to confuse caution with cowardice, a confusing and painful misunderstanding that leads me to avoid even the smallest risks. I find myself stuck in the same place, wearing safety like a shield, but feeling more like a prisoner. What I thought was prudence starts to feel like a trap. There's a cruel irony in that cycle. It's not the fear of financial loss alone that haunts me. It's the relentless feeling that I should be better right now if only I hadn't fallen before. That haunting thought, that creeping what if, erodes my confidence more thoroughly than any bank statement ever could. It tells me I'm not ready, that I'm not capable, that maybe I should just give up. And those whispers get louder as the days go by, until they drown out hope altogether. Sometimes, I catch myself shying away from a new idea, a possibility, or even a simple decision that might improve my situation. The voice inside reminds me of the last time. I think of all the money lost, the plans that failed, the people who doubted me. I can almost feel the sting of those past mistakes folding around me like a cold blanket, and with it, the urge to retreat wins again. It's easy to tell ourselves stories about prudence, about waiting until we're ready. But where does the patience end and paralysis begin? How do we recognize when we're protecting ourselves and when we're shutting down the very chance for growth? Those lines blur in ways that feel confusing and cruel. Yet, beneath it all, I know this resistance isn't just about money. It is about our relationship with ourselves, the voices we listen to and the wounds we carry. I've often wondered why this fear feels so real, even when I can logically see that my next step might be smaller, safer, or backed by knowledge. Why does my body react first, before reason even talks? Why does hesitation sometimes roar louder than hope? These questions kept me restless, caught in a loop of wanting change and being terrified of risking it. This internal tension, the war between what we want and what we fear, holds so many of us back, even when opportunity gently knocks. The challenge, I've learned, isn't about dismissing fear or throwing caution to the wind. It's about understanding what's really going on inside, what stories I'm telling myself, and how to move forward not in spite of those feelings, but alongside them. In the silence of those moments, when hesitation grips me, I realize there is something more at play, something beneath the surface, more powerful than logic or motivation. This is a story about how the fear of financial mistakes can hijack our very minds and hold us hostage. But more importantly, it's about how we can reclaim control, how we can learn to listen differently, feel differently, and ultimately, step forward again. I want to share that journey with you. Because if you hear your own story in mine, if you feel that same tightening in your chest when decisions come knocking, know you are not alone. There is a path through this heaviness, a way to move beyond the silent prison of fear and into a place where mistakes become stepping stones, not stumbling blocks. So, as we move through this together, I invite you to explore your own experience, the deep emotional echoes beneath your financial choices, and the true cost of that fear. What story is your heart telling when the mind argues for caution? And what if we could rewrite that story, carefully, gently, step by step, so that the next time opportunity appears, your body and soul are ready to say yes? There was a time when I believed that hesitation was simply a fleeting annoyance, a temporary pause before action. Yet I discovered it's far more insidious, sculpting patterns in my brain that subtly dictate my responses without my consent. I recall sitting at my desk, a promising investment opportunity gleaming on my screen. My fingers hovered over the mouse, but an invisible weight settled on my chest. It wasn't just caution. It resembled an old defensive reflex, like my body was protecting me from an unseen threat. That internal alarm system doesn't just react to external risks. It replays past episodes like a looping soundtrack, conditioning me to retreat before I've had a chance to analyze the facts. This reaction, I realized, isn't rooted in deliberate thought, but woven into my implicit memory, the kind of remembrance my conscious mind might never fully grasp. For instance, whenever a chance to invest or save emerges, my mind conjures vague images of prior loss, but without clear reasons why. It's as if my brain has cataloged these experiences not as isolated events, but as part of an enduring narrative. Better to avoid risk because pain awaits. The tricky part is the translation of this subconscious archive into physical sensations: tight jaw, clenched fists, shallow breath, not just silent thoughts. It's an emotional ecosystem that works quietly to prevent perceived harm, albeit at the cost of growth. One evening, reflecting on this unseen network of conditioning, I considered a metaphor. My mind is a vast library, but many books are mislabeled or misfiled. The stories I've read repeatedly aren't always accurate representations of reality, but outdated versions amplified by stress. When I try to pick a new chapter, I often reach for a well-worn volume, marked by past misfortunes. This misclassification leads me to overestimate the likelihood of negative outcomes and underestimate my ability to recover or adapt. Rewiring these beliefs requires not only intellectual effort, but also emotional courage, a willingness to step beyond the shadows of the old narratives. The way the mind deals with uncertainty creates another layer of complexity. Uncertainty is a breeding ground for mental constructs that distort perception. When confronted with ambiguous choices involving finances, my instinct found safety in overgeneralization. If it failed before, it will fail again. That sweeping conclusion ignores changes in context, learning, and the possibility that a different approach can yield success. Rather than seeing opportunities as dynamic puzzles, I viewed them through a lens clouded by generalized mistrust, which invariably led to avoidance behaviors. I realized that such internalized rules function as cognitive shortcuts, ways my brain conserves energy, but they sacrifice nuance and adaptability. In the midst of navigating this tangle, I encountered a powerful realization. Emotional memory doesn't just inform present decisions, it sometimes hijacks them. The brain, in its quest to protect me from pain, deploys a biased threat detection system that misconstrues caution for paralysis. This defensive stance morphs into a chronic state where potential rewards are overshadowed by perceived risks, regardless of their actual magnitude. Consequently, I found myself prone to overanalyzing seemingly simple financial moves, prolonging indecision until the opportunity quietly slipped away. This lingering hesitation turned from a protective shield into a cage. Something else became clear when I considered the interplay between identity and financial decision-making. I often caught myself attributing failures not to external factors or chance, but to personal inadequacy. When I lost money or stumbled, my inner critic whispered that I was inherently flawed, reinforcing a damaged sense of self. This toxic self-assessment embedded itself deeply, generating a feedback loop where my worth was tied to flawless performance, an impossible standard that guaranteed disappointment and eroded my willingness to engage. It dawned on me that healing required disentangling my sense of value from external outcomes, offering compassion in place of condemnation. A concrete turning point came during a conversation with a close friend. I confessed my reluctance to seize new financial opportunities, expecting judgment or unsolicited advice. Instead, my friend simply asked, What would change if you saw mistakes as stepping stones instead of traps? That question ignited a spark. For once, I wasn't asked to defend my hesitation or deny my fears. Instead, I was invited to rethink the narrative altogether. It was an invitation to see vulnerability not as weakness, but as a gateway to resilience. I began journaling my thought processes and feelings as they arose, noticing the distinct moment when anxiety took hold and gently challenging those automatic alarms. As I practiced this self-exploration, I noticed the subtle shifts unfolding. The physical symptoms, racing heart, constricted breath, that previously ushered me into retreat now became signals to pause and inquire. Rather than a command to avoid, these sensations transformed into prompts to engage more mindfully. It was as if I was retraining my body's language, teaching it to tolerate discomfort as a normal companion on the path to progress. This embodied awareness brought a new level of clarity. I started recognizing when fear was amplified by unresolved emotional wounds rather than actual risk magnitude. In particular, I began applying this insight during small decisions, choosing to set aside a modest amount each week, exploring new budgeting tools, or signing up for financial literacy courses. With each deliberate step, I gathered evidence disproving the exaggerated warnings my mind once sounded. Gradually, trust built, a fragile but vital bridge connecting past experiences with present possibilities. This process was neither neat nor linear. Setbacks emerged occasionally, but the pattern shifted from avoidance to gradual engagement. Now, consider how this applies when you face a tempting financial choice. Instead of ignoring the tremor inside or dismissing it as irrational, try meeting it with curiosity. Ask yourself what story your body and mind are telling and whether those impulses reflect present reality or echoes of earlier pain. You might uncover beliefs carried from childhood, messages absorbed during difficult times, or internal dialogues that have long outlived their usefulness. By bringing these voices into conscious awareness, you gain the power to question their authority and, eventually, rewrite the narrative guiding your behavior. In time, this introspective work feels less like battling an enemy and more like befriending a wary old guardian, one acting out of a deep desire to keep you safe, even if misguided. With patience, compassion, and steady practice, the guardian's grip loosens and freedom takes root. I don't claim the process is easy or swift, but recognizing the intricate mechanisms that fuel hesitation is the first essential step toward reclaiming agency and forging a more empowering relationship with money decisions. One afternoon, as I sat in a bustling cafe, a lively debate unfolded at the table beside me. Two friends discussed their recent financial gambles. One accused the other of reckless optimism, while the accused defended the leap as necessary growth. Listening to their animated exchange, I felt a familiar tug within me, a yearning to join, but also a paralyzing doubt. I realized my own reluctance wasn't solely the shadow of past setbacks, but also tangled with a deeper narrative I'd long overlooked, the subtle weight of conflicting inner identities. Inside me, there was a constant tug-of-war between the part that wanted to seize new opportunities and the shadow self that clung to safety, mistrusting change. This wasn't just fear. It was a clash between versions of myself shaped by different experiences and beliefs. The cautious voice was rooted in a survival mindset, forged during times when mistakes felt catastrophic, not just financially but emotionally. Meanwhile, a more curious, ambitious self dreamed of progress, but often found no clear pathway to express that impulse without triggering inner alarms. I started journaling conversations with these parts of me, giving each a name to humanize the inner struggle. Guardian was my protective side, forever scanning for threats and quick to sound alarms. Explorer was the part eager to venture forth, filled with hope and restlessness. By externalizing these voices, I could separate their messages instead of collapsing into a singular, overwhelmed identity. Through this dialogue, I understood that my guardian, the one quick to veto risk, was not my enemy but a deeply loyal protector. Its intensity stemmed from a place of care, not malice. This revelation transformed my view of internal conflict from battle to negotiation. Rather than trying to silence the guardian, I began inviting it to participate in decision-making. For instance, when a new financial choice appeared, I'd pause and ask myself, "What's your concern, Guardian? What risks do you foresee that I might be underestimating?" This approach often surfaced anxieties I hadn't fully acknowledged, like memories of past betrayals or the sting of unsaid criticisms from people I trusted. By naming these worries, the Guardian's warnings lost some of their grip and became more manageable. One evening, after such an internal negotiation, I took a small but meaningful action. I allocated a modest sum toward a project I had long hesitated to support. As I confirmed the transfer, my body buzzed with a cocktail of excitement and nervousness, a physical reminder that embracing complexity introduced discomfort but also growth. Watching the confirmation screen, I felt like a tightrope walker stepping onto a slender wire, tense yet exhilarated. Over time, these gentle internal conversations yielded profound insights. I realized how my past experiences had overwritten my sense of agency with learned helplessness, subtly convincing me that mistakes defined who I am. However, by consciously engaging both the cautious and adventurous sides within, I could craft more nuanced decisions honoring both protection and progress. This internal alliance felt like discovering an inner council rather than a battleground. An unexpected result of this process was how it reshaped my external interactions. When financial questions arose, I noticed I was less defensive and more curious, asking for opinions without fearing judgment. This openness created new avenues for support rather than isolation. In one instance, I sought advice from a mentor and admitted my hesitations openly. Their response wasn't dismissal but affirmation that uncertainty is natural and that nudging forward despite it is where courage thrives. Reflecting on these changes, I compared my journey to tending a fragile plant. The Guardian was like a careful gardener wary of overwatering or exposing the seedling to harsh conditions, while the Explorer represented the sunlight and nutrients necessary for growth, but risky if unchecked. Balancing these forces required patience, ongoing attention, and a willingness to embrace imperfection. Some days, I'd wilt under the weight of doubt. On others, I'd bloom in unexpected ways. This dynamic interplay between inner voices illustrates why financial decisions can feel so complex and heavy. It demonstrates that hesitation isn't merely a symbol of weakness, but signals a deeper shoring up of safety and identity. Our minds often construct elaborate early warning systems, built from the bricks of prior pain and protection. Recognizing these systems as layered dialogues rather than monolithic barriers enables an empowering shift from feeling trapped by fear to entering into conversations with our inner selves. Imagine the next moment you face a monetary crossroads. Instead of rushing or retreating, allow space to listen to both your warnings and your possibilities. Ask those internal voices what they need to feel heard and safe. Invite them into a respectful exchange rather than an exclusionary fight. By doing so, you craft an internal ecosystem where caution fuels wise vigilance and curiosity fosters brave exploration. One evening, as I closed my journal after such an exchange, a calmness settled deep within me. The internal arguments hadn't vanished, but the tension lightened. The Guardian no longer silenced the Explorer, and the Explorer no longer dismissed the Guardian's concerns. Together, they steered me forward with measured confidence. It felt less like walking on a precarious wire and more like learning to dance, a rhythm of advance and retreat, attuned to subtle shifts but always moving ahead. While sifting through memories tied to my financial choices, I stumbled upon a vivid recollection that hadn't surfaced before. I was sitting on my porch, sipping coffee, when a wave of unease washed over me at the thought of reallocating my savings. Not because I lacked information or rational assessment, but because a faint echo of voices from long ago murmured their doubts into my present. These voices weren't just warnings. They felt like ancestors whispering caution, carved into the fabric of my psyche. It dawned on me that these subconscious narrators, born of years' worth of experience and cultural influences, had subtly shaped my automatic responses to money matters. I became curious about this internal chorus. Who were these figures? Whose words had I internalized as truths? I began to recall scenes from my childhood, episodes where financial concerns cloaked the atmosphere with tension, even when adults avoided discussing details openly. The quiet anxiety wasn't always vocalized, but its weight seeped into familial dynamics. That ambient apprehension operated like an invisible mentor instructing me. Money is scarce, mistakes are shameful, and risks equate to danger. This internal mentorship established patterns not easily overturned by logic or fresh information. Diving deeper, I recognized how these ingrained narratives functioned like unseen puppeteers orchestrating my emotional reactions. For example, when opportunities appeared promising, I sensed immediate tension within my chest, as if my system was preparing for an impact. This preparatory response resembled how my mind had learned to anticipate loss or judgment before outcomes could even manifest. Physical sensations became the gatekeepers of my decisions, effectively overriding conscious evaluation. What intrigued me was how this pattern wasn't isolated. It intersected with my broader emotional landscape, influencing self-worth and interpersonal trust. A striking moment occurred when I compared these automatic patterns to an old operating system running on a modern computer. The software was designed for conditions no longer relevant, but still dictated functionality. Similarly, my mind applied outdated templates to new financial contexts, generating responses misaligned with present realities. Understanding this mismatch sparked a subtle empowerment. If these patterns were software, could I reprogram or update them? This question inspired experiments with mindfulness and somatic awareness, approaches that allowed me to observe sensations without immediate reaction, gently expanding the space between stimulus and response. Amid these efforts, I encountered the complexity of fear's camouflage. The emotional undercurrent that restrained me rarely surfaced as overt panic. Instead, it whispered doubts, coaxed postponements, and nurtured rationalizations. For instance, I noticed how internally I justified avoidance with phrases like, "I'm just being sensible," or "I need more time," masking fear beneath a veneer of prudence. This subtlety complicated self-awareness. Emotional resistance often masqueraded as deliberate choice. Becoming fluent in this disguise required developing a keen eye for linguistic and bodily clues that betrayed hidden tension. On a practical level, I started sharing these revelations with close confidants. In conversations, my usual guardedness softened as I revealed the unique flavor of my hesitations. Their reactions ranged from surprise to empathy, helping me realize how isolation magnified internal struggles. This exchange became a vital reminder that financial fear isn't a solitary battle. It's intertwined with shared human experience. The recognition that others wrestled with similar unseen forces infused me with warmth and diminished shame. During this period, I also observed how social narratives about money influenced my internal script. Society often champions success and condemns failure in stark terms, leaving little room for nuanced understanding. Consequently, I'd internalized harsh judgments that equated financial missteps with personal flaws. Yet, I found subtle resistance emerging when I reframed failure as a source of insight. By embracing mistakes as data points instead of verdicts, a progressive shift began to take root. This reframing opened portals of curiosity toward my own financial history and nurtured an experimental mindset. A poignant instance unfolded when I documented, in writing, a timeline of my financial errors accompanied by the emotions they awakened. I confronted feelings ranging from embarrassment to resentment, but also recognized resilience unnoticed before. This exercise illuminated how emotional memory archives weren't only burdens, but also resources carrying lessons and strength. In embracing the full spectrum of these experiences, I cultivated greater self-compassion and clarity, which in turn softened my reactions to emerging opportunities. Facing each new financial decision, I practiced pausing, not automatically defaulting to withdrawal, but observing the mind-body signals with a gentle stance. This pause transformed habitual responses into moments of choice. For example, the quickening pulse signaling apprehension became a prompt to breathe deeply, acknowledge the fear's origin, and intentionally envision outcomes beyond worst-case scenarios. These simple rituals aggregated small victories over time, building trust that discomfort did not equal catastrophe. Now, consider your own encounters with financial hesitation. What unseen voices influence your instincts? How do your body and mind converse before you act? By attending to the nuanced choreography of sensation, thought, and ancestral narrative within, the door to greater agency swings open. Herein lies the possibility of crafting new scripts, ones that honor past wisdom without being imprisoned by it. The path begins with noticing these faint murmurs and inviting a dialogue that respects complexity while nurturing transformation. I remember the moment distinctively, the chill creeping up my spine as I sat at my kitchen table, balancing a calculator in one hand and a mountain of bills in the other. It wasn't uncertainty about arithmetic or whether I had enough funds. It was an almost tangible resistance rising from somewhere deeper inside me, as if an invisible wall was forming between me and any forward motion. My mind raced to justify an action. I should wait till I'm absolutely certain, it insisted. At the same time, a quiet storm brewed beneath the surface, fanning a sense of vulnerability I hadn't acknowledged for years. Over time, I recognized this sensation was more than hesitance. It was a defense mechanism formed by the unseen psychic architecture built around previous losses and regrets. Interestingly, the defense didn't reveal itself in blunt fear. Instead, it manifested in a peculiar form of hypervigilance, a relentless mental replaying of what went wrong. I could picture it as a looped tape record, each cycle whispering cautionary tales about missteps, magnifying the stakes, and inflating dangers. The more I watched that loop, the less space remained for hope or fresh perspectives. I started journaling these cycles, noticing how my thoughts often shifted into frames of blame, not toward others, but inward. I blamed myself for a lack of wisdom, foresight, or even moral fortitude. Those silent accusations carved grooves in my self-image, etching an internal script that said, I am defined by my mistakes. It reminded me of a cracked mirror distorting an otherwise whole reflection. With every crack, confidence splintered into shards. Rather than inviting gentle repair, I tended to avoid the mirror altogether, refusing to face parts of myself that seemed broken beyond repair. One afternoon, I forced myself to confront this discomfort by recalling a particular financial blunder, a missed investment opportunity where fear had won out. I remembered the rush of adrenaline, the sinking chest, and the palpable urge to retreat to safety. As I listened to that memory, a surprising realization emerged. I had mistakenly equated caution with prudence and inaction with wisdom. That conflation had held me hostage, cloaking avoidance in the guise of responsibility. The logic felt airtight, yet the outcome was stagnation cloaked as self-protection. Digging deeper, I also found that those overlapping feelings weren't solely personal, but reverberated through social interactions and cultural messages. Phrases like financial discipline is everything, or you reap what you sow echoed in my head, sharpening judgments and heightening the sense that failure was a reflection of personal failure. I recalled a family dinner when, after revealing a past mistake in money management, someone remarked, "You should have known better." Their casual words, though fleeting, echoed across years, reinforcing the idea that errors were unacceptable. These moments had bred a formidable voice of self-critique that thrived beneath my surface calm. A turning point came during an impromptu conversation with a financial coach who asked, "What story are you telling yourself about failure, and how might it be limiting you?" That question unsettled me in the best way. I realized that my internal narrative wasn't just descriptive, it was prescriptive, dictating how I allowed, or denied, myself to engage with possibilities. I saw that by framing failures as terminal verdicts rather than chapters of growth, I was setting myself up for ongoing paralysis. The perspective shift wasn't immediate, but it planted the seed for transformation. I began experimenting with small acts of cognitive rebellion. For example, when thoughts arose warning me against risk, I challenged them with evidence of resilience I'd previously overlooked. I wrote letters to my past self, acknowledging mistakes but celebrating lessons gleaned. These exercises acted like mental stretching routines, loosening tight patterns formed from tension and fear. Over weeks, I noticed a softening in the grip those memories held on present choices. The struggle turned less about fighting shadows and more about learning to coexist with them in a less intimidating light. An unexpected companion in this evolution was physical movement. One rainy morning, after wrestling with anxiety about reallocating savings, I went out for a brisk walk. The cold air filled my lungs sharply, snapping me out of rumination. When I returned, my body felt less locked in resistance. In a subsequent session, I tried breathwork, noticing that paying intentional attention to inhales and exhales shifted the narrative from fight or flight to grounded presence. It was clear that the mind and body had been allies in this protective stance, and both needed retraining to embrace change with compassionate steadiness. Now, think about the moments when the urge to withdraw grips you before any active thought. What biological currents run beneath your hesitation? Recognizing these as communication rather than obstruction opens a pathway for curiosity. You might find that beneath sensations of dread lies a whisper of self-preservation, hoping not to repeat past pain, but lacking a safe roadmap forward. This nuance steers us away from blame and toward an examination of how coping strategies evolved to fit particular contexts, but now require thoughtful unlearning. There's a subtle but powerful shift when we view inaction not as failure itself, but as a coded message from our interior ecosystems, one that invites us to pause, listen, and respond differently. In embracing this invitation, I've come to see risk-taking less as a leap into the unknown and more as a dance with discomfort, guided by self-awareness and tempered patience. Within this dynamic, I've begun to reclaim my ability to engage openly with opportunities, no longer imprisoned by the echo of mistakes, but accompanied by a deeper trust in my evolving resilience. At one point, I found myself staring at an offer that should have ignited excitement, an opportunity that aligned nearly perfectly with a long-held ambition. Still, a peculiar tightness gripped my chest, not unfamiliar, yet subtly different from the usual hesitation. It was as though my nervous system had been trained to respond not only to failures, but also to success's risk, casting a shadow on anything that hinted at change. I realized I had been viewing growth as a battleground, where triumph and defeat seemed dangerously intertwined, leaving no room for gentle progression. I recall vividly a moment when I confided in a close friend about this paradox, a conflicting mix of eagerness and resistance swirling inside me. They asked simply, "What stories have you told yourself about what success means?" Their question unsettled me because the stories were older than the opportunity, woven into my sense of identity. I had equated advancement with sacrifice, framing gains as either fleeting or costly, which turned possibility into risk by default. This revelation lifted a veil, revealing how deeply I had internalized scarcity beyond financial measures, scarcity of safety, trust, and steadiness. Exploring this tension further, I noticed how expectations from others had layered onto my experience, molding my emotional reflexes around opportunity. Conversations about money often carried an undercurrent of skepticism or judgment disguised as advice. I remember a family gathering where a relative warned against being too hopeful, implying naivety awaited anyone who dared to leap. While those words were intended to protect, they served as a subtle blueprint for wariness, training me to anticipate disappointment before endeavors even began. This conditioned approach converted optimism into an emotional risk assessment long before logic engaged. Another moment stands out, a workshop where participants shared their money stories. I hesitated to speak, fearing exposure of a vulnerability I guarded fiercely. When I finally articulated my fear of repeating earlier mistakes, the room didn't recoil or dismiss me. Instead, stories flooded in, others' narratives of resilience and reinvention. The collective vulnerability created a tapestry of shared experience that rejuvenated my sense of belonging and reframed failure as a thread woven into the fabric of growth. It became clear that isolation had magnified my fear. Connection provided a potent antidote. In the weeks that followed, I noticed shifts appearing in my behavior. Small choices, once overshadowed by indecision, began to gain clarity. Instead of postponing tasks like budgeting or researching options, I set incremental goals, treating these steps less as imperatives and more as experiments. For example, I decided to allocate a tiny portion of my funds to a high-interest savings account, framing the action as a curiosity rather than a gamble. That reframing transformed the internal dialogue, from one questioning worthiness to one celebrating agency. It was like emerging from a dense fog into soft morning light. An insight that transformed my perspective was recognizing that fear often masqueraded as cautious planning. Sometimes, elaborate analysis wasn't a sign of prudence, but of avoidance dressed in complexity. I caught myself assembling exhaustive pros and cons lists that served as comfort blankets, allowing me to delay decisions endlessly. Recognizing this pattern called for honesty and discomfort, admitting that my mind could be crafting barriers while convincing me they were bridges. This awareness didn't erase fear, but it gave me the clarity to act despite it. One chilly evening, I took a deliberate step and enrolled in an online financial course aimed at beginners, something I had previously shied away from, fearing exposure or failure. During the live Q&A, I asked questions openly, revealing gaps I had long felt ashamed about. To my surprise, facilitators and peers responded with encouragement and practical guidance, dismantling layers of isolation and shame. That moment of engagement illuminated how reaching out in vulnerability could rewrite my relationship to learning and growth, replacing suspicion with connection. Now, consider how your own narratives around success and safety might shape your reactions when progress approaches. What ancestral or cultural threads tug at your emotions, weaving expectations or fears into the present? Are there places where hope's arrival triggers avoidance, as if happiness itself is precarious? Naming these forces can shift their unspoken power, transforming silent saboteurs into collaborators. When opportunity knocks, tuning into this dialogue allows you a moment's grace, not to leap blindly, but to step forward authentically, informed by awareness, not overshadowed by unresolved stories. The path unfolds not as a straight line, but as a dance between caution and possibility, where embracing discomfort becomes a language spoken fluently rather than feared. Through embracing vulnerability, accepting imperfection, and fostering connection, I learned that hesitation is a signal, not a stop sign. It invites questions we must patiently and bravely explore, revealing layers beneath the yes and no we so often seek. In this unfolding, we cultivate an inner compass calibrated not only by risk and reward, but by compassion and hope. One cold evening, as rain tapped steadily against my window, I found myself tangled in a familiar battle, a tug-of-war between the impulse to leap forward and an almost magnetic pull to retreat. At this point, I realized my heart had learned to respond to opportunity much like a cat experiences sudden movement, immediately ready to freeze or run before assessing if the threat is real. This instinctive recoil seemed less about logic and more a reflex shaped over time, anchoring me in a place where possibilities dimmed before they even had the chance to shimmer. I thought about an old river near my childhood home. During rains, the water would surge quickly, sometimes rising unpredictably. In those moments, I learned to step back and wait, not out of fear of water itself, but because the river's unrest was layered with unseen currents beneath its surface. Similarly, my responses to chances to grow often came wrapped in invisible undercurrents. Echoes of past turmoil swept beneath the veneer of caution. It was only after recognizing these hidden currents that I could begin navigating them. This meant tuning into my body's messages not as obstacles, but as signposts inviting deeper inquiry. Conversations with others also revealed new dimensions. During a dinner with a close friend, I shared how my instinct to pull away had intensified despite better knowledge and experience. Their question startled me. What if your body is guarding something more fragile inside, like hope itself? Their words lingered, urging me to look beyond surface fears. It wasn't just about avoiding failure. It was safeguarding hope from being shattered again. This fragile hope, delicate yet vital, had become entwined with every choice, demanding protective vigilance that sometimes felt suffocating. That night, I reflected on times when protecting hope had quietly disguised itself as resisting change. Like an overprotective parent wrapping a child too tightly in blankets so they don't catch cold, I realized I had been swaddling my potential in heavy layers of self-protection. The irony was painful. What I tried to shield was suffocating beneath its own armor. This insight was a challenge to learn balance, to let hope breathe without constant guarding, allowing it to take risks safely, even with the possibility of pain. Exploring this tension further, I found moments when my mind's chatter escalated into a screenplay of what-ifs so vivid they felt like forewarnings carved in stone. One afternoon, while deciding whether to update my budget my imagination flooded with scenarios where mistakes compounded disastrously, trapping me in webs of regret. The experience was overwhelming, leaving my resolve as brittle as dry leaves. Recognizing that my mind was spinning elaborate cautionary tales instead of presenting facts became a turning point. I started to visualize these stories as clouds, shifting shapes, often dramatic, but always temporary. This metaphor gave me the distance to acknowledge fears without letting them dictate my steps. On a practical level, I tested new strategies to coax trust from my restless mind. One such method involved setting what I called a micro-commitment, a bite-sized promise to myself that felt manageable yet meaningful. For example, I committed to reviewing just one financial article a day instead of attempting overhaul plans or drastic changes. The shift from grandiose plans to manageable pieces transformed apprehension into curiosity. Over time, these small victories accumulated, knitting together confidence threads previously frayed by doubt. A particularly vivid example occurred during a weekend workshop about personal finances. Surrounded by strangers, I felt the usual swirl of anxiety, and yet, something was different. When invited to share a moment of financial bravery, I hesitated, then spoke about how I recently negotiated a minor bill adjustment on my behalf, a detail I never considered notable. The group responded with warmth and encouragement, transforming what felt like a lonely struggle into a collective triumph. This shift from isolation to community illuminated the power of shared narratives in healing emotional fissures tied to money. I noticed also how timing played a subtle yet significant role in managing my fears. Early morning reflections, when the mind is softer and less burdened by daily noise, became fertile ground for gentle exploration. In these quiet hours, I could approach difficult questions with less urgency and more patience. For instance, instead of forcing a decisive yes or no to an opportunity, I allowed myself the space to sit with the feelings, jotting down sensations and thoughts as they unfolded naturally. This process decreased overwhelming pressure and cultivated a steady rhythm of self-trust. Now, consider how you respond when faced with moments that promise change but trigger an unseen recoil. What feelings rush through your body before words emerge? Can you imagine those feelings as messages from a place that yearns for safety, for the preservation of something precious within? Inviting curiosity here, toward the quiet protectors inside, opens an unexpected pathway. It's a journey toward coexistence with these impulses, learning to honor them as guardians of hope, not barriers to growth. In my ongoing story, learning to engage this delicate balance has been like tuning a finely strung instrument, requiring patience, attentiveness, and the willingness to embrace imperfection. Through each step, small commitments, vivid reflection, heartfelt sharing, I've taken strides to let hope unfurl gently, no longer confined by urgency or fear, but embraced as a tender, living force guiding me forward. Late one evening, as the city lights flickered through my apartment window, I found myself wrestling with an uneasy sensation that had little to do with numbers or logic. It was a gnawing restlessness simmering beneath my skin, a subtle, persistent unease that whispered cautions I couldn't easily silence. At first, I tried to shove it aside, convincing myself it was mere indecision. Yet over time, I realized this sensation was far more complex. It was a tangled weave of anticipation and dread, woven tightly into the fabric of my experience. This feeling reminded me of standing at the edge of a vast forest I once explored as a child. The trees stretched endlessly, their canopy blocking out much of the sunlight, and the shadows shifted unpredictably with the wind. The forest was inviting and intimidating at the same time, a place where adventure met uncertainty. When I faced moments of financial choice, this same paradox emerged, a path forward sprinkled with possibility, yet shadowed by memories I hadn't addressed. I noticed that even small decisions could trigger this internal wilderness, where old fears lurked like hidden roots ready to trip me up. One afternoon, while scrolling through opportunities on my phone, I noticed my heart constricted and tension gripped my shoulders. Instead of rushing to act or turning away immediately, I decided to pause and become a silent observer of how these reactions unfolded. I imagined myself as a cartographer, tracing routes through uncharted emotional terrain. The The sensation was like encountering a sudden drop-off in an otherwise smooth path, a place where hesitation rooted itself physically and emotionally. This curiosity created a crack in my usual reflex to withdraw, allowing a sliver of illumination into the emotional labyrinth. Conversations with a trusted therapist deepened this exploration. During one session, she asked me to recount a recent situation where anxiety had overridden my intentions. As I illustrated the sequence, from the rising knot in my chest to the retreating impulse, I realized these reactions were entwined with not just fear of loss, but a yearning to control uncertainty itself. It wasn't solely about avoiding mistakes, but about insulation against an unpredictable future that felt too large to manage. This insight shifted my understanding. The impulse to recoil wasn't a flaw, but a protective response to overwhelm. To test these insights, I began experimenting with creative expressions, drawing, journaling, and even dialogue writing where I gave voice to fragmented feelings. One notable evening, I sat with a blank page and started writing what my anxiety could say if given a voice. To my surprise, it confessed a deep loneliness, a fear of being unprepared, and a desperate need for certainty. This internal monologue reconnected me with my vulnerability in a way numbers and spreadsheets never could. I learned that honoring this inner dialogue, rather than silencing it, opened pathways toward reconciliation. With this fresh perspective, I introduced rituals into my routine that acknowledged tension instead of trying to overcome it hastily. After a stressful workday filled with financial considerations, I would light a candle, let the soft flicker anchor my attention, and breathe slowly into that subtle resistance. These moments of mindfulness became a kind of emotional first aid, gentle care for the parts of me that bristled at change. Gradually, the cracks in the armor widened, creating space for new ways to engage with risk. I recall a specific moment, just after a meeting where I hesitated to commit to a promising project. Instead of succumbing to avoidance, I decided to reach out to a mentor, admitting my fears openly. Their response surprised me. It's okay to feel uncertain. Courage is acting while uncertain, not after certainty shows up. Those words rang like a bell in a quiet hallway. They offered a refreshing reframe, not an invitation to reckless abandon, but a call to embrace imperfection as an integral ingredient to progress. Reflecting on this, I noticed how cultural scripts about stoicism and invulnerability had shaped my reluctance to admit fear openly. I'd been taught that strength meant hiding doubt, keeping emotion tucked away like a secret shame. Yet, vulnerability had unveiled itself as a source of clarity and connection, not weakness. Allowing myself to name my apprehensions in conversations with friends dissolved some of the isolation and tapped into a collective wellspring of shared humanity. Now, imagine those moments when hesitation rushes in as a storm sweeping through your chest. What messages might it carry about what you need? What if it is less a barrier and more a messenger, warning against haste, asking for gentleness, inviting pause? Opening to this inquiry transforms tension from an adversary into a guide. It teaches us that growth does not demand the absence of fear, only a willingness to listen and move forward in its company. Reflecting on this journey so far, I sense how the strands I've explored are weaving together beneath the surface of my awareness, forming a pattern I couldn't quite perceive before. It's as if I have been navigating a dense forest with only shards of light guiding my steps, each illumination revealing textures and shadows that both conceal and illuminate paths ahead. The complexity of these experiences, once fragmented and confusing, now begins to pulse with a rhythm that both challenges and invites me deeper. There is a peculiar alchemy unfolding within me, a convergence of knowing and feeling that refuses simple explanation. The echoes of past hesitation, buried safeguards, and quiet longings are no longer isolated islands but currents in a vast, shifting sea. This movement calls attention to the subtle interplay between instinct and awareness, a delicate dance that eludes control yet offers the possibility of harmony. It strikes me how often our most profound resistance masks a yearning for transformation, a yearning that speaks softly beneath layers of protective scripts and hidden fears. I recall a moment recently when the tension within me was so palpable it seemed nearly physical, a tightness coiling around my ribs and spreading through my limbs. In that instant, rather than pushing it away or dismissing these sensations, I found myself pausing to listen as though those sensations carried a message waiting to be heard. The body, in its own eloquent language, was expressing truths not yet articulated by the mind. A dialogue began to emerge, one where discomfort was no longer an adversary demanding escape, but a messenger inviting presence, attention, and curiosity. It occurs to me that approaching these feelings with gentleness transforms the landscape entirely. What seemed like barricades start revealing doorways etched in unlikely places, cracks shaped by vulnerability and moments of surrender. I recognize now that resilience doesn't emerge from the absence of fear or hesitation, but from engaging with them without surrender or suppression. The process feels less like conquering an enemy outside and more like reconciling with a neighbor within, someone whose language I'm only beginning to speak. My inner world has expanded in ways I didn't anticipate. Where once there was a fog obscuring my intuition and insight, now stretches of clarity ripple through. These glimpses are both fragile and fierce, illuminating possibilities that had been simmering beneath the surface, waiting to be acknowledged. Each discovery nudges me to sit more patiently with uncertainty and discomfort, trusting that the gentle unfolding of understanding holds more transformative power than any hurried leap. The dance between wanting to move forward and recoiling is no longer a war zone. There's a subtle grace in these oscillations, a pulse that suggests the tension itself carries wisdom. It is reminiscent of an ocean tide, where each ebb is necessary preparation for the flow. Instead of longing to silence the tide, I've started embracing its rhythm, listening to the stories it tells about readiness and restraint, presence and possibility. In the quiet moments, I catch myself smiling softly as I realize how often I resisted the inevitable flow of growth. I had mistaken stillness for stagnation, forgetting that beneath the surface, roots are strengthening even when the branches seem motionless. This insight infuses me with a hopeful patience, a conviction that even the smallest tender movements contain seeds of profound change. As I journey onward, I feel a growing trust in this evolving relationship with my financial self, trust grounded in self-compassion and tempered by mindful curiosity. There's a richness to the process now, a texture formed from acknowledging every hesitation and uncertainty as essential threads in a larger tapestry. This tapestry is still unfolding, its design far from complete, but unmistakably alive and beckoning. I invite you to sit with these reflections alongside me. Feel the gentle pull between caution and courage reverberating within. Sense the layered whispers beneath your own decisions, the quiet voices that have guarded and steered you, often without your awareness. There is a kind of sacredness in this tension, a fertile ground where transformation begins not through force, but by meeting the shadow and light within ourselves with open-hearted presence. The terrain ahead may remain uneven and the pace unsteady, yet there is a power in embracing this complexity as a part of the journey, not a detour from it. Together, we learn that movement toward financial freedom is never merely external. It pulses through the subtle workings of trust, patience, and the ever-deepening dance with ourselves. As I sit here reflecting on the winding path that brought me to this moment, a quiet sense of clarity begins to settle around me. One not born from rapid insight or sudden breakthroughs, but from the slow, steady unfolding of understanding over time. It's as if the tangled threads of doubt, fear, hope, and resilience that once pulled me in conflicting directions have woven themselves into a tapestry of nuanced strength. I realize now that the weight I carried, those silent whispers urging caution, the ache of past mistakes echoing through my choices, was never meant to imprison me. Instead, they were invitations to learn a new language, how to hold uncertainty gently, how to value hesitation as a form of wisdom, and how to recognize that courage often hums quietly in the spaces where fear lingers. I remember moments when opportunity shimmered within arm's reach, and my body reacted with an urgency to step back. The breath quickening, the pulse racing, not signals to run, I now see, but tender reminders of a self that has weathered storms and asks for patience. The tension that once felt like a barrier is revealing itself as a compass that points toward areas of growth still waiting to be embraced. It feels like encountering an old friend who speaks in riddles, whose warnings came from a place of care, even if the message was tangled in apprehension. My challenge has become learning to listen with kindness, to honor these sensations while choosing to move forward anyway. There was a time when I believed progress required certainty, a flawless map guiding each step. Now, I understand that the journey often unfolds through acts sacred in their imperfection, small, sometimes trembling decisions fueled by tentative optimism. I think of the first time I allowed myself to lean into discomfort rather than evade it, marking a shift from survival to lived experience. How strange and liberating it felt to acknowledge vulnerability without capitulating to it, to offer space for doubt without surrendering dreams. That tension, previously unbearable, became a dance partner, a presence inviting me to explore boundaries instead of barricading them. Each encounter with fear unveiled new textures beneath my assumptions. I found that the stories I told myself about past errors were less about failing and more about belonging to a lineage of humanity deeply imperfect, yet endlessly capable of renewal. There is a profound beauty in recognizing that shortcomings do not define us. Rather, the way we engage with those moments, the courage to try again, to embrace the unknown, carves the contours of our resilience. I learned to see my financial story not as a ledger of wins and losses, but as an unfolding narrative rich with lessons, compassion, and evolving possibility. One afternoon, while walking under a sky heavy with clouds, I felt a shift within, a lightness born not from resolution but acceptance. Acceptance that growth rarely follows a straight line, and that hesitation can be a sacred pause rather than a halt. This recognition rippled through me like a gentle tide, crafting space where self-judgment once dominated. I began to relate differently to the rhythms of progress and retreat, understanding them as parts of the same dance rather than opposites in conflict. I want to speak to you now, standing where I once stood, caught between past hurt and future hope. If you feel held back by memories of decisions that went awry, know that the scars you bear have their own intelligence. They are imprints of lived experience that inform but do not imprison you. There is a richness in your story ripe for cultivation, a potential for transformation waiting in the quiet spaces your mind may fear to tread. Let fear be a signal, not a sentence. Allow it to teach you steadiness instead of stasis, introspection instead of isolation. Moving forward is less about silencing the fears that haunt us or ignoring the ghosts of mistakes past. It's about befriending those parts of ourselves that clench tightly when faced with unknown terrain, welcoming them to the decision-making table, not as dictators, but as advisors. Within this invitation lies freedom. Freedom to honor your instincts without being bound by them. Freedom to cultivate patience without resigning to stagnation. Imagine for a moment a garden at twilight, where shadows stretch long, but flowers still lean toward the fading light. The richness of growth depends on both illumination and dark. So too does our relationship with money and self, held in a delicate balance of courage and caution, risk and care, ambition and tenderness. With each step taken in honest awareness, we begin nurturing a financial narrative that is whole, complex, forgiving, and alive. As I close this chapter of reflection, I carry with me a renewed commitment to listen deeply, act with compassion, and meet the unfolding unknown with bravery shaped by authentic presence. Our stories are not defined by the avoidance of error, but by the continuous weaving of hope through challenge. In this living process, we find not just financial freedom, but an embracing of the very human journey toward wholeness.